My name is Dr. Mehmet Çiftçi. I'm in charge of overseeing our program of lectures and conferences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Pusey House. And also to the first lecture in our packed program for this term. Please, if you haven't taken one already, take one of our term cards with you so you can find out all about what we have planned for this term. There's so many interesting things organised that we work very hard to arrange. Next Wednesday, the lecture will be delivered by one of the most senior post holders in the Faculty of Theology, Professor Marcus Bockmuhl, who will be speaking on Jerusalem in early Christian hope. We have some very interesting conferences coming up. We have a conference on Anglo-Catholic socialism. We have a conference on sacramental confession coming up. Another one on the genealogy of post-liberalism, which will Professor John Milbank will be taking part in that one. Some of you may have heard of him. And then at the very end of the term, there'll be a conference on the possibilities of a Christian revival in public life, which we will be organising in partnership with the Danube Institute. So lots of interesting things happening. Please take away a term card if you want to know more. All of these details are, of course, also available on our website. Before I introduce our speaker, I've also been asked by Dr. Paul Shumton to mention that there is a Newman seminar happening at Oriel College, and this will be taking place on the even weeks of term at 5:30 in the McGregor Room at Oriel College. It will be exploring the life and teaching of John Henry Newman, and our speaker is actually going to be the first person presenting at the Newman seminar next Monday. So you are welcome to speak to Paul about that afterwards. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Mr. Ryan Blank, soon to be Dr. Ryan Blank. He's just completed his PhD in modern British history at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. His thesis investigated how men in the Oxford movement conceptualized the emotion and experience of friendship, and how that, and the implications that had on the intellectual and theological development of the Oxford movement. He's currently head of politics at Harrow School in London, and is an affiliated researcher at the Centre for Theology, Law and Culture here at Pusey House. I should also mention that he's also been a very faithful supporter of the Centre for quite a while, so we're very grateful to you for that, and we're also very grateful to you for making the time to come and speak for us. So please join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thank you so much, Matt.
And thank you, of course, to Pusey for the invitation to come speak. It's very exciting to get to waffle on to an interested audience for a change. As mentioned, I'm normally a schoolmaster, and right now I should be teaching a lesson on the Congress of Vienna to 12 and 13-year-olds, and this is a bit more fun. The initial talk title I suggested, but was told was slightly too long, is one that I'm going to read aloud, not as a change of title, but rather as a framing mechanism. And so the initial title I proposed was Spiritual Renewal, Friendship and Ethos and Institutions, the Founding of Keble College and Pusey House. You can see by way of 3 ands, it probably was a bit too long. In October of 1879, as Edward Pusey prepared for his retirement from public life, he determined to give up his role on the governing council of Keble College. Keble College was established in 1870 as memorial and monument to John Keble, Pusey's friend and fellow Anglican clergyman. The two men had become acquainted during their Oxford careers in the 1820s and 30s. However, their friendship and shared work largely centered around their determination to effect a spiritual renewal in Oxford and in the Church of England more generally. This program of religious renewal was initially provoked, according to their friend Richard W. Church, by certain vigorous effort for the immediate defense of the Church against serious dangers arising from the violent and threatening temper of the days of the Reform Bill of 1832. The essential worries of this group of clergymen, called Tractarians because of the series of 90 pamphlets or tracts that they published, were that the Church of England had forgotten her apostolic and Catholic nature, become an appendage of a secularizing and liberalizing state, and was failing in her cure of souls. The evidence of this stagnation and degeneration, as they saw it, was the Roman Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which allowed Roman Catholics to hold public office and take seats in Parliament, and the Church Temporalities Act of 1833, which appointed a board of ecclesiastical commissioners for Ireland to oversee the reduction of Church of Ireland bishoprics. Both of these acts, in conjunction with the Great Reform Act of 1832, seemed to indicate, as John Keble preached from St. Mary's pulpit, that the United Kingdom was abandoning God and entering an era of national apostasy. Among their friends and fellow leaders of the Tractarian movement, or Oxford movement, were John Henry Newman and Richard Hurrell Froude. Yet when Pusey attended Keble's funeral in 1866, Froude had been dead for 30 years, and Newman had been a Roman Catholic priest for 21 years. Keble's death affected Pusey tremendously. The funeral was attended by a list of eminent clergymen, members of Parliament, and government ministers, baronets, high-ranking officers, the architect William Butterfield, and the celebrated and widely read authoress Charlotte Young. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Oxford sent their apologies for not being able to attend. The pulpit, lectern, and chancel were draped in black and white instead of the Easter decorations that had been prepared before the news of Keble's death reached Hursley, and the Keble's customary stall was left empty. The music was all Gregorian. The choir and clergy chanted the De Profundis from the church to the grave, and all the clergy wore surplices. Liddon recorded in his diary that he found Dr. Pusey in his bedroom, quite overcome and unable to speak. With great difficulty could I persuade him to take any food. After the funeral, as Pusey, Henry Liddon, and others of their friends were sitting in Keble's house, they determined to establish a memorial for Keble, one that they hoped would continue Keble's life's work of encouraging spiritual renewal in the Church of England. This memorial was to be a new Oxford college, named for the prophet of Hursley, and funded by public subscription in honor of the author of one of the Victorian period's most widely read devotional books, The Christian Year, in which they hoped to provide an inexpensive education for gentlemen that would encourage them to be loyal sons of the Church of England and produce cohorts of Anglo-Catholic clergymen. To protect this new institution from university meddling, Keble College's Charter of Incorporation of 1870 gave control of the college not to a group of fellows, but to the warden and an external council, in the hopes that this external council would maintain Anglo-Catholic orthodoxy. Pusey was among the founding members of Keble College's governing council, but in 1879, and amid growing ill health, Pusey needed to appoint his successor. Pusey wrote to Edward Talbot, warden of Keble College, to express his anxiety about who should succeed him as a member of the Keble College Council. The composition of the council was essential to Pusey because, even though they would affect very indirectly the character of the training of the young men, which is, by the charter, wholly lodged in the hands of the warden, Pusey recognized that the ethos of the college and the guarantee of its fidelity as a foundation to the teaching which characterized John Keble and which is stamped by the charter on the college lies in the soundness of the council. Part of Pusey's concern was tactical and procedural. He understood that at some point Talbot might be required to relinquish the wardenship for another ecclesiastical position. However, Pusey was also concerned that the ethos his successor would impart might lessen the Anglo-Catholic fidelity. Keble College, established as a memorial to John Keble and a way of projecting the Keblean project of Anglican renewal through the friendly conveyance of the Catholic ethos, required a fidelity among its governing body. Pusey was adamant, I, with one other, am mainly responsible for the existence of the college and the name which it bears. I have then a responsibility for it. He required that his successor be one who should intelligently and definitely, with whatever influence a member of the council has, maintain the principles upon which it was founded. Pusey named his chosen successor in the preceding paragraph of this letter to Talbot. I am very anxious that successor should be one whom I have known intimately for many years, who is one of singular moderation as well as wisdom, who can discriminate with singular sagacity what is essential from what is not essential. C. Wood. This letter indicates the importance Pusey placed on friendship and intimacy to ensure the continued integrity of the Keblean project. Just over 10 years previously, in 1867, W.J.E. Bennett argued that the real question as to the success of any work must be determined by its ultimate, not by its immediate results, by its pervading character, not by local or temporary failure, and by extension, that the Oxford movement's successes had been a consequence of the pervading character of the friendships which sowed it. The ethos of Tractarian male friendships, communicated through shared intimacies which united them spiritually and intellectually, was the driving force of the development of the Oxford movement. Keble College and later Pusey House were both set up to transmit and nurture that Tractarian ethos, and which would preserve their namesake's own ethos as the genie locorum of their respective institutions. However, despite the similarity of the impetuses, as memorial foundations, their practical arrangements were decidedly distinctive. Keble College was established as a formal college within the University of Oxford. As an institution, its mission was to preserve the high Anglican character that had been such a mainstay of college life within the university, and be a launching point from which future Anglo-Catholic mission would spring. Pusey House was founded in 1884, by contrast, as a chaplaincy to the university. Had the Tractarians been successful in reforming English spiritual life in Oxford, such an institution would have been redundant and unthinkable. In a collegiate university where every college had its Church of England chapel, there was no need for an institution to exercise a chaplaincy or mission to the university. Furthermore, the two institutions represented two distinct approaches toward ethos formation. Keble College formally matriculated university undergraduates who gained a formal affiliation to the college. Pusey House, as a chaplaincy, was only ever designed to have a small formal membership of priests. Rather, it was designed to rely upon an informal affiliation or affinity. These distinct approaches towards Tractarian spiritual renewal go back to the very beginning of the Tractarian project, and both attempt to resolve the problems associated with doubt and perceived moral deficiency. The concept of affinities provides a way of identifying both the distinctive strains of theological development within Tractarianism and a means by which to trace the ethos of particular friends upon each other. By using the term affinity, a term brought about by Dr. Samuel Johnson's definition of friendship, which was then authoritative, and the work of Sarah Foote on Anglo-Saxon monastic affinities, I mean to acknowledge that within Tractarianism, certain distinctive strains of thought emerged as friendships and proximities evolved. An affinity is an informal collection of friends in close physical, intellectual, or emotional proximity. An example of this that is readily obvious is the group of Romanizing Tractarians around John Henry Newman at his pseudo-monastic college at Littlemore. This community, despite their relative geographical proximity to Oxford, shared a particular proximity in their daily ritual, research projects, emotional attachments to each other, and their shared intellectual and moral propensity towards Roman Catholicism, which made them distinct from other groups of Tractarians. In contrast, institutions formalize relationship structures. These relationships can include friendships, for example, friends within a college. The nature of institutions is such that relationships are necessarily formalized. Where one might affiliate with friends due to affinity, one has an institutional tie with all the inmates of an institution. Unity is regulated not by affection, but by rules. This distinction reflects the different focuses of certain affinities within Tractarianism. The, quote, Keble school at Oxford was largely uninterested in institutions, until John Henry Newman attempted to focus the efforts of the Keble school on tutorial reform at Oriel College. Newman's proposed tutorial reform being an example of creating institutionalized relationships between tutor and tutees, which might engender affinities. Pusey's Oxford affinity and Newman's Littlemore affinity both became interested in institution building, in the shared project of creating the House of Study, and in their separate projects of the Sisterhood of the Holy Cross and Newman's Pseudo-College at Littlemore. The Oxford affinity continued to emphasize institution building throughout the 1870s and 1880s, something that the Hursley affinity, in contrast, was much less interested in. John Keble and Thomas Arnold, I've jumped. When John Keble accepted an Oriel tutorship in 1818, a post he held until 1823, he described it to John Taylor Coleridge as a species of pastoral care. Keble was fresh from his first curacy, and although he was still a curate at East Leach for the first few months of his time as tutor, he soon resigned the curacy in favour of his younger brother and devoted himself to Oxford life. To Coleridge again, Keble described his walks in Christchurch Meadow, with old Dyson discussing sundry subjects for sermons and settling in his Oriel rooms, conveniently located just opposite those of his other friends Tucker and Cornish at Corpus. In 1818, Keble was 26, and still full of that boyish vivacity of character for which he was known by his intimate friends. But as Keble immersed himself in the role of college tutor, his attitude towards the office began to find the existing system wanting. On the 30th of April 1818, Keble wrote to Coleridge, "Well, here I am settled after a manner in Oriel, and very comfortable I find it, yet not so comfortable as my home and curacy. That was not to be expected." Keble had found his time as a curate fulfilling because it fulfilled his understanding of his ordination. His tutorship, though a species of pastoral care, seemed more about helping young men develop their intellectual faculties than about ministering to their souls. Becoming a college fellow was to launch a young man from a brilliant undergraduate career to a career in the church. When Thomas Arnold joined Keble at Oriel as a fellow in 1815, Arnold too embarked on this journey. Prior to Arnold's election, he confided in Keble some doubts about the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Arnold was determined not to approach a fellowship and the ensuing progress towards ordination dishonestly. Consequently, Arnold demurred being ordained a deacon until speaking with Keble and Coleridge about his doubts. Keble took these doubts seriously, but diagnosed that Arnold's issue was less with the doctrine of the Church than with Arnold's need for all things to have a rational explanation. Arnold's religion was civilized. It required that Christianity be subject to reason as the proof of Christianity's unique truth. Keble found this a dangerous preoccupation. To Coleridge, Keble wrote, "I have not talked with Arnold lately on this distressing thoughts which he wrote to you about, but I am fearful from his manner at times that he has by no means got rid of them, though I feel quite confident that all will be well in the end. The subject of them is that most awful one on which all very inquisitive reasoning minds are, I believe, most liable to such temptations. I mean the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity. Do not start, my dear Coleridge. I do not believe that Arnold has any serious scruples of the understanding about it, but it is a defect of his mind that he cannot get rid of a certain feeling of objections, and particularly when, as he fancies, the bias is so strong upon him to decide one way from interest. He scruples doing what I advise him, which is to put down the objections by main force whenever they arise in his mind, fearful that in so doing he shall be violating his conscience for a maintenance sake. I am still inclined to think that the wisest thing he could do would be to take John May, a young pupil who I was desirous of placing under his care, and a curacy somewhere or other, and cure himself not by physic, i.e. reading and controversy, but by diet and regimen, i.e. holy living. In the meantime, what an excellent fellow he is. I do not think that one might safely say, as someone did of some other, one had better have Arnold's doubts than most men's certainties." This lengthy quotation, which I've included because it highlights the way in which Keble characterized Arnold's doubts, outlines Keble's solution to these doubts, and demonstrates the role of friendship, in this case tutoring, in resolving those doubts. Each of these must be considered in turn because of the influence this experience with Arnold would have on Keble's own spiritual and pastoral development. Keble characterized Arnold's doubts as being the temporary effect of his defect of mind. That is, Arnold, like many with an inquisitive mind, fixated on understanding received truth for himself, without regard for the role of sacred tradition in transmitting that truth. Consequently, Arnold scrupled to accept the doctrine of the Trinity on the basis of its antiquity or the authority of the Holy Church. Keble believed that Arnold would outgrow this preoccupation as he settled into a life constructed around holy living. Arnold's studies have emphasized that Thomas Arnold's program at Rugby was built out of his own conviction that Christianity ought to be focused on Christian living rather than dogma. This emphasis has largely been understood as running counter to the Tractarian interest in theology, tradition, history, and the apostolic claims of the established church. Arnold took Keble's advice, but went with it in the opposite direction. Since the doctrine of the Trinity seemed unable to be scrutinized rationally, it must not matter. Therefore, Arnold employed the Keblean concept of holy living in an opposite direction. From 1814 until Arnold's 1836 publication of the Oxford Malignants, Arnold's position could be maintained in relative harmony with Keble's own, and their friendship and intimacy continued. Keble recognized that Arnold's liberalizing tendencies were exacerbated by the esprit then proximate in Oriel. Arnold saw that an Oriel fellowship would open career opportunities and provide him with a material benefit. However, to Arnold's credit, he demurred from accepting dogma based on material gain or convenience. Keble advised him to put down the objections by main force, in other words, to accept the doctrine of the Trinity upon the basis of authority and submit himself accordingly. Keble, comfortable with the idea that the sublime and holy lay beyond the realms of man's understanding, was satisfied by appeals to authority, especially the Church's apostolic authority. Arnold was not satisfied in this manner, but accepted Keble's advice and applied himself to his newly acquired fellowship at Oriel. While Keble may have hoped that such a fellowship would have been the making of Arnold, and it was, Keble had not counted upon the intoxicating atmosphere of liberalism at Oriel and the effect this would have on his young friend. Keble's final recommendation was for Arnold to take upon himself the tutoring of a young man, a friend of the Coleridge family, named John May. May's father was a high churchman and a Tory. So far, safe. May was himself a serious-minded youth in need of some academic coaching. Keble hoped that by taking on this role, Arnold would resolve his defect of mind because of the more practical focus on instructing John May. Furthermore, such a role would keep Arnold focused on reading the set texts of the curriculum and any moral works which Arnold set as companion pieces. May's youth would prevent Arnold from assigning him any novel or challenging work of theology, and the whole tutoring would be focused on transmitting fundamental truth as received from the Church, rather than embarking upon theological research into the controversies of the day. Here one can see at work the influence of another of Keble's friends, John Miller, and his Bantam Lectures of 1817, a volume Keble regularly suggested his friends read. Keble's diet and regimen of tutoring would keep Arnold focused on holy living as he set an example for John May. Finally, the friendship which would ensue would be a mutually reinforcing element that would strengthen, Keble hoped, Arnold's own convictions. From 1819, Arnold's career took him far from Keble and Oriel, consequently lessening their physical proximity, but also allowing for their moral tastes and ethos to diverge. Keble's failure to wean Arnold away from the liberalizing Oriel Noetics, the group of academics to which Arnold had become attached at Oriel, which included Dr. Richard Whately, Wren Dixon Hampden, Edward Hawkins, and Edward Copleston, all of whom were prominent in college leadership and who would be among the Oxford movement's most significant early critics, by appealing to Arnold's institutional role as a college fellow or Anglican clergyman, seems to have caused a minor confidence in Keble's confidence that the institutional college system would be, of itself, a bulwark against heterodoxy and liberalism. A further failure, this time related to his mentoring of the probationary fellow, Hartley Coleridge, the son of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his friend John Taylor Coleridge's cousin, showed the limitations of institutional discipline on spiritual renewal and moral reform. At this time, Keble seems to have begun to quietly attempt a minor project of spiritual renewal amongst his own undergraduates. To whatever classical works his undergraduates had chosen, Keble emphasized the ethics and the analogy as key texts for his students to read together, so that they might heighten their moral taste and develop their intellect. While Butler's analogy and Aristotle's ethics were not revolutionary choices, indeed they were both required reading, but on separate lists, these texts stand out from those one might expect Tractarians or proto-Tractarians to fixate on. The ethics is not a Christian text. Butler's analogy is dense and not uniquely high church. Yet Keble's understanding of Anglicanism, as enriched by these texts, gave him a renewed sense of the Catholic and consequently emphasized his traditionalism against Oxford's rationalizing and liberalizing tendencies. By impressing these texts on his tutees, Keble was arming them, giving them a metaphysical idealization of what friendship could be through the ethics, a sense of how to distinguish between types of friends and between vice and virtue, and through the analogy, a standard of Anglican orthodoxy which would be a shield against rationalism and liberalism. Significantly, Aristotle and Butler both articulated ideas about friendship as it related to goodness, and Keble's innovation was to use them as comparative texts. Keble's understanding of ethos was built upon Butler's conscience-guided reason. Friendship, then, was a way in which God could shape an individual's character such that it was capable of loving others, and that this newly awakened love would bind the lover to goodness. Keblean ethos and the friendship that communicated it played a significant role in the development of what Isaac Williams called the Keble School, an informal group of friends which included Keble's tutees like Sir William Heathcote, Isaac Williams, Richard Wilberforce, Richard Hurrell Froude. I say Isaac Williams, so he's only informally attached as a voluntary tutee to Keble, as he was a student at Trinity. Many of whom became involved in the Oxford movement, who admired Keble as an academic heavyweight and moral mentor. Kicking against the noetical fashion in Oriel, Keble believed that moral rightness was necessary for true intellectual development, and that, when harnessed together, moral rightness and intellectual endeavor brought the individual to enter a higher communion with God. Keble, scarcely older than his pupils, and with a natural charm and engagement, attached himself affectionately to his pupils, and many of them attached themselves with equal warmth to him, something Coleridge credited to Keble's manner, which was perfectly simple and unpretending. If he were ignorant and unable to answer a question or explain a difficulty, there was no attempt at concealment, nor could any pupil fail to see that his well-doing was at least as great a cause of happiness to his tutor as to himself. This easy manner came naturally to Keble, and won him over many intimacies and lifelong friendships, including Sir William Heathcote. Keble's letters to the undergraduate Heathcote reveal a warmth of friendship, intimacy, and emotion. After Heathcote returned to Hursley House for an extended vacation, Keble wrote, "Take care of yourself, read as much Homer, Herodotus, and Cicero as you conveniently can." Keble's academic expectations were tempered by his knowledge that Heathcote was among his family, and besides, had the duties incumbent upon an owner of a large estate. Thus, Keble continued, "I do not mean to be very angry with you if I find, when we meet, that you have not done very much in the reading way, having daily sad experiences as to how difficult it is to keep one's good resolutions when at home." Against this backdrop of sympathy, Keble mentioned his own reading, "I have been dipping into a very Homeric person, one Plato, in order to be a match for you in the politics, and hardly know whether to laugh, cry, or be very much delighted with him." Keble's tone towards Heathcote was consistently jocular and friendly, almost that of two equals in friendship instead of tutor and student, which might be indicative of his youth, but also of his evolving tutorial practice. In 1819, alongside his brother, Thomas Keble, John Keble started to read and study the Republic, and he shared the appreciation that he gained for the sublime and beautiful. To Heathcote, Keble wrote, "I came away convinced of my own incapacity for understanding the sublime and beautiful when I do see it, and consequently the better reconciled to living in a country which has no pretensions to either." And this, of course, from the author of The Christian Year. Sir William Heathcote was a lifelong friend to Keble and became a stalwart lay defender of Tractarianism. When the living of Hursley became available to him, Heathcote immediately offered it to Keble. Coleridge's A Memoir began with a dedication to Sir William, and Heathcote played a vital role in Keble's post-Oxford life by appointing him to the vacant living at Hursley, as we've just discussed. From 1835 until his death in 1866, Keble would live in Hursley across the Great Park from his friend Sir William Heathcote, and the opportunity for friendship-making and establishing intimacy jars in the modern understanding of teaching as a power dynamic-ridden occupation. Yet Keble understood that for him to exercise a true care of souls in the Christian sense, he needed to become intimate with the men in his care. Keble gave Heathcote extra tutorials, allowing Heathcote to read with him at extra hours, an offer which Keble afforded those pupils with whom he formed particularly intimate bonds or in whom he took a keen interest. Significantly, despite the presence of so many of his old friends at Oxford, Keble described Heathcote as one of his greatest comforts at Oxford, a sign of their abiding friendship that transcended the formal and institutional relationship of tutor and tutee. Keble's friendship and the informal affinity network that this friendship brought between Keble's friends was a driving force for spiritual renewal that operated, at times, parallel to the college institution, and at times even outside of it. Thus, the Keble School is an example of the power of friendly affinity, and if instead of aligning the history of the Oxford movement with the Anglican career of John Henry Newman between 1833 and 45, one reorientates the Oxford movement to be a constellation of friends around John Keble, one can see a direct continuity of a project of spiritual renewal in Oxford and the Church of England, which began with Keble's 1823 Southrop Reading Party until the death of Edward Bouverie Pusey in 1882. From 1835, Keble was rarely present for any length of time in Oxford, and as vicar of Hursley, his primary focus was on his parish ministry and nurturing his friendship with the informal Keble school. His involvement in the Tracts for the Times is consistent with this. While John Henry Newman, a convert to the Keble school through his friendship with Richard Hurrell Froude and Edward Bouverie Pusey, became the Tractarian movement's leaders, Keble's role was that of mentor and spiritual advisor through his friendship with them. And Keble's interest in institution reform, or building, seems to have been fairly limited, except where his advice was solicited. Froude, Newman, and Pusey, enmeshed as they were in the institutional life of college and university, were much more interested in systematizing Keblean friendship with an eye towards institutionalized spiritual renewal. No account of Tractarian institution building should omit the proto-Tractarian attempt at Oriel College tutorial reform from 1826 to 30. Their establishment of the Theological Society and its transformation into the House of Study from 1835 to 8, the Pseudo-College of Littlemore, 1838 to 45, and Pusey's various attempts at setting up Tractarian brotherhoods and sisterhoods as Anglican religious orders, the most significant for us being the Sisterhood of the Holy Cross in 1845. In January of 1825, Newman agreed to become one of Oriel's tutors, despite his initial misgivings about the compatibility of a college tutorship with the duties of a clergyman, because a clergyman was given over to the cure of souls, which was, as Newman saw it, an altogether different project than academic mentoring or even developmental mentoring. The role of a college tutor was primarily seen as one which was orientated around coordinating and delivering academic instruction to college men, and Newman began his tutorship after Easter 1825, when Robert Wilberforce and Richard Hurrell Froude were elected college fellows. Importantly, Wilberforce and Froude would join Newman as college tutors from 1827, and the three of them attempted unsuccessfully to adapt Keblean principles of spiritual renewal through friendship into the institutional operations of Oriel College until their collective resignation from the role in 1830. Newman was a conscientious tutor, and his diaries are filled with notes from his teaching, including specific memoranda of what he read with particular pupils and proposed essay topics. Newman frequently corresponded with his pupils outside of term to advise them on their studies and encourage their further progress. However, he vastly preferred to help them in person. Proximity was important for tutoring because, as Newman wrote to Arthur Tarbot, one of his pupils, "I should have been most glad to see you, and more can be said to the purpose in half an hour's conversation than by means of the fullest letter." Joseph Blanco White likened Newman's pedagogical style to Plato's own, and White teasingly referred to him as my Oxford Plato. This Platonic susceptibility perhaps rendered him increasingly open to the influences of Froude and Robert Wilberforce, but not yet fully aligned with them, as indicated by Newman's noted reticence about Keble's proposed election to the Oriel provostship in 1827. Despite the Platonic nature of Newman's tutoring, few of his earliest pupils would become affiliated with the Tractarian movement, which is perhaps an indication of the distinction between Newman's pre-Tractarian and Tractarian pedagogy. When in 1827 Provost-elect Edward Hawkins and the senior tutor John Dornford consulted Newman on who should be appointed to vacancies among the Oriel tutors, Newman indicated his intention to remain a tutor for years to come and hinted that he and Robert Wilberforce should be joined by ability. Foremost among Newman's suggestions were Richard Hurrell Froude. On 18 October 1827, Newman wrote to his mother to confirm that Froude would join our tutorial staff, which, he said, is very strong this term. 4 tutors, Froude coming in, additional, and Pusey as censor theologicus, i.e. reviewer of the sermon notes. Newman was highly contented with the additions of Froude and Pusey to the tutorial staff, and wrote Samuel Rickards, "We are a large party here, and a most formidable body of officers. We have 5 tutors, i.e. Froude, a 4th, and reclaimed Pusey, who takes the sermon abstracts this year. This is glorious. And F and P are right principled in their ideas of discipline." In March of 1828, Newman responded to Blanco White's request for setting up a letter-writing club between himself, Newman, Froude, and Wilberforce, with some conditions seemingly inspired by the Keble school. Newman urged that it would be necessary that we should all hold the same truths, even if they disagree as to the relative importance they gave them. For words are not feelings, nor is intellect ethos. This is Newman's first recorded usage of the term. He went on to describe both intellect and ethos. Intellect, Newman described as but the attendant and servant of right moral feeling in this own weak and dark state of being. Intellect supplies a medium of communication between mind and mind, but it is weak. And when we think we can detect honest principle, purity of heart, and a single eye, it is irrational to delay the recognition of these real excellencies till we have settled subordinate points. Newman then emphasized his dependence on Froude's authority for lowering the intellectual powers into handmaids of moral nature, and challenged Froude and Wilberforce to give us some account of the connection, how far, of speculative error with bad ethos, e.g. in what is a consistent Socinian a worse man than an orthodox believer. In the space of 1 month, Newman became wholly immersed into the language of the Keble school, and was on his way to becoming convinced that Aristotelian cum noetic phronesis was not enough on its own to cultivate the right moral character, but that Keblean ethos, in its more Platonic vein, was essential to the project. Nothing came of White's proposed letter-writing club. However, the idea there generated perhaps manifested into Newman's own dining club, and later in the creation of the Theological Society. Here White's proposal seems more indicative of the 18th century understanding of character, whereas Newman's Keble school influence response is representative of the growing weight with which the Oxford movement would endow character. The transmission of Kebleanism from Froude and Wilberforce to Newman must have occurred partially as a result of his experience of their shared ethos, and perhaps as well, as Newman would later attest, through the ethos exerted by the genius loci of Oriel College itself. However, the high points of Keblean Romanticism would most strongly influence Newman as a direct result of his intense friendship and intimacy with Richard Hurrell Froude. After the exhausting and acrimonious rejection of their efforts at tutorial reform by Provost Edward Hawkins, Newman accompanied Richard Hurrell Froude and the Archdeacon Froude on a miniature and modest grand tour, visiting Gibraltar, Malta, the Ionian Islands, Sicily, Naples, and Rome between 1832 and 33. Newman arriving back in Oxford on the 9th July, 1833, a mere 5 days before John Keble delivered the Assize Sermon on National Apostasy at St. Mary's Church, Oxford. John Keble's Assize Sermon on the 14th July, 1833 was considered by Newman, and therefore by R.W. Church, as the beginning of the formal Oxford movement, a date which makes sense as an institutional beginning of a formal movement. It was inspired by this sermon that Richard Hurrell Froude, John Henry Newman, Isaac Williams, and others of their friends, all by then disciples of John Keble, began the Tracts for the Times series. It is against this backdrop of a friendship group united by their admiration for John Keble that Newman's claim in the Apologia that Keble was the leader of the Oxford movement makes sense. There can be no doubt that with Keble's active parish ministry in Hursley and Froude's departure for Barbados in the autumn of 1833, that Newman took on the coordination of authors for the Tracts for the Times, its editing, organizing for it to be published and distributed, and also coordinated the Tractarian efforts in Oxford. Keble was not there. And of course, Newman's letters reveal his active leadership. Newman was the most charismatic, best connected, and academically significant member of the Keble School resident in Oxford in 1833, and initially detractors of Tractarianism called it Newmania. In the words of R.W. Church, it wasn't until towards the end of 1834 and in the course of 1835 an event which had a great and decisive influence on the character and fortunes of the movement occurred. This was the accession to it of Dr. Pusey. Edward Bouverie Pusey brought the weight of an aristocratic canon professor of Christ Church to the Oxford movement and contributed his erudite biblical scholarship. Newman in the Apologia wrote, "Dr. Pusey gave us at once a position and a name. Without him, we should have had no chance, especially at the early date of 1834, of making any serious resistance to the liberal aggression." The triumph of recruiting Pusey came at a cost to the Newman-centered movement, as it gave the movement a second head, in close sympathy with its original leader, but in many ways different from him, Dr. Pusey became, as it were, its official chief in the eyes of the world. For dramatic effect, of course. Both Newman and Pusey received Keblean spiritual renewal first through their friendship with men who were attached to the Keble school rather than through Keble directly. Newman through Richard Hurrell Froude, and Pusey through his friendships with Newman, Robert Wilberforce, and Isaac Williams. Pusey's biographer and friend Henry Liddon recorded that while Pusey was originally sympathetic with the early tracts for the times, he had no desire to be attached to them. Isaac Williams recorded the conversation between Newman and Pusey, which brought Pusey firmly into the Tractarian camp, writing, "Pusey was at this time not one of us, and I have some recollection of a conversation which was the occasion of him joining us. He said, smiling to Newman, wrapping his gown around him as he used to do, 'I think you are too hard on the peculiars, as you call them. You should conciliate them. I'm thinking of writing a letter myself with that purpose.' 'Well,' said Newman, 'suppose you let us have it for one of the tracts,' which Pusey eventually agreed to do. While Pusey had been acquainted with Keble and friendly towards him, it was from this shared project that Pusey's friendship with Keble deepened, and through his association or affinity with Keble's friends, through which Pusey began to be influenced by the Keble school. By 1835, Pusey had replaced Newman as the intellectual heavyweight behind the Oxford movement, and was their most senior university figure. Despite this, from 1835 until the publication of Froude's Remains in 1838 and 1839, Pusey himself seems to have looked to Newman for leadership. In 1835, Pusey and Newman founded the Theological Society, which seems to have grown out of Newman's earlier attempts at tutorial reform, but relocated this outside of the collegiate system and into a sort of proto-theology faculty, the theology faculty not yet existing, albeit one which was exclusively Tractarian in tone and was only informally connected to the university. There are not many sources about the organization of the Theological Society. Pusey was the first to address the society on the 12th November 1835, reading a paper on the general subject of theology, with Newman following on Friday next, the 20th November 1835, with a talk called The Rule of Faith, a paper Newman had previously read to Froude. The meetings were held at Pusey's house in Christ Church College, and Newman recorded the first meeting was attended by himself, Pusey, Robert Williams, Thomas Dyke Ackland, John Frederick Denison Morris, and several strangers. Either the society met irregularly, or Newman's letters and diaries do not record every meeting. The next entry for a meeting of the Theological Society records that on the 11th December 1835, Benjamin Harrison, one of Pusey's acolytes, reading a paper that had been written by John Keble. It is clear that Newman envisioned that the Theological Society would be instrumental to the rejuvenation of the Church of England, as in February of 1836, Newman wrote to his friend John Bowden about the upcoming Hampden controversy. "Our Theological Society will increase in consequence at once. What a lucky thing it is just set up. My final scope in devising it was to restrain vagaries of H, Rendix and Hampden, and such as he, but I little thought it would be so soon needed." While Newman's aspirations for the Theological Society may seem a trifle far-fetched, it had gained notoriety. The old High Churchman, Hugh James Rose, had needed reassurance about it from Newman after having heard that it was a malignant, unfair account because of its importance in creating a church faction. Despite Newman's assurances to Rose, he informed Froude that the men who attended the Theological Society wanted to publish a theological journal, and that Newman hoped to push them in the direction of taking over an existing publication. Given this is a letter, and in this context of Newman's takeover of Rose's British Critic, and Newman lists a series of authors and articles that are being written which would later feature in the British Critic, it seems that the British Critic was what Newman had in mind. And these, of course, were based on talks given to the Theological Society. It is logical then to assume that the Theological Society was the place in which Tractarian theology was explored and developed before being formally published in magazines like the British Critic, the British Magazine, and other Tractarian publications. As an institution, the Theological Society at this point seems to have been a fairly loose organization, more based on informal affinity than formal membership. In 1837, Newman and Bowden developed a plan for a house of young apostolicals, the term the Tractarians used to describe themselves in the 1830s, such as we had afterwards at St. Aldate's. This was the first mention of what would become known as the House of Study, which first operated as a group of Tractarian undergraduate lodgers living with Pusey in his house in Christchurch, before Pusey was able to install them in a property on St. Aldate's. Various friends, including Pusey, Maria Gibbon, and John Bowden, contributed the funds to support the House of Study, and it became the first of many attempts to create a sort of house for young monks. This is a quote. Frank Turner, I've jumped. The inmates of the House of Study were all affiliated with other colleges or recent graduates lacking fellowships. Newman installed J.B. Moseley as its leader. He was to supervise a reading and collating establishment which would have a shared project in the patristic research for the Library of the Fathers. It was from the House of Study that Newman's Littlemore experiment evolved. Now I'm going to say a name in here that might get boos and hisses, but Frank Turner began his treatment of Newman's Littlemore affinity by calling it Catholicism as companionship and coterie, a framing of friendship which seems to lack a fuller understanding of Tractarian concepts of ethos. A growing problem for Tractarianism was the tendency of many of its young adherents, steeped in the theology of Newman and immersed in a particular reading of the patristics, to idealize Roman Catholicism. From 1840, Newman began to base himself more permanently in Littlemore, where he was serving as a parish priest. With the help of his friend Charles Merritt, he bought a parcel of land near his church and built a sort of college. To this college, he invited many of his younger friends from the House of Study to live in contemplative retreat and research. The communal life at Littlemore straddled something between college life and monastic life. The Littlemore College inmates prayed and fasted together, often meeting in Newman's private oratory for the daily offices. Newman resumed his role, unofficially, of being a tutor, supervising the studies of these young men through his direction of the Lives of the English Saints project. The aim of this project was to produce a series of idiomatic translations of the lives of important medieval saints, in order to prove that the Church of England was in continuity with the medieval Church, bridging the gap between the Church of the Fathers and the Church of the Victorians. While some detractors argued that the content of their study led them almost entirely to abandon the Church of England and convert to the Church of Rome in 1845, coinciding with the publication of the Lives, one cannot help but wonder if the Keblean idea of ethos is significant here too. The principle of ethos is that friends exert influence on each other's moral taste and understanding of knowledge. Almost all of the young men who joined Newman in Littlemore did so partially to avoid conversion to Catholicism, because their patristic research or studies had made them believe themselves susceptible to it. Newman's Littlemore College was supposed to hedge them in the church by setting up the formal institutional restraints that would keep them safely lodged within the Church of England. Ultimately, this group of men seems to have found the institutional parameters of the Littlemore College less powerful than the ethos they exerted upon each other, an ethos which shifted them Romewards. As early as 1833, Froude had suggested to Newman that the need for priests, especially in urban areas, outstripped the financial capabilities of the parishes that would need to be created for them, and suggested that in order to make slum parishes possible, they should look at establishing small collegiate institutions throughout England where groups of priests could live together to reduce costs. While it would be some time before Tractarians attempted to organize such priest houses, Pusey's foundation of the Sisterhood of the Holy Cross in 1845 built on the idea of shared living for urban mission. Liddon recorded that the first call for such institutions was found in the condition of the great cities, and especially of the East End of London, which for many years had occupied so large a place in Pusey's thoughts and charities. In December of 1839, Pusey wrote to Keble, "Newman and I have separately come to think it necessary to have some sœurs de charité in the Anglo-Catholic Church. My notion was that it might begin by regular employment as nurses in hospitals and lunatic asylums." From the outset, Pusey House accepted. From the outset, Pusey's conception of Anglo-Catholic religious orders was essentially tied to the idea that these ought to be active and not contemplative. The religious would need to take vows that would tie them to their institution, including celibacy and consecration of their life to God's service. The first of these Anglican sisters, Marian Hughes and Lucy Pusey, Pusey's teenage daughter, made their vows privately to Pusey in 1841 and then received communion from Newman at a service at St. Mary's, Oxford. Sister Marian Hughes then departed for France to observe a community of Ursulines in Bayeux before returning to Oxford. Lucy Pusey's death in 1844 provided the catalyst for Pusey to found an Anglican sisterhood. Lucy Pusey, on her deathbed, had repeated that this was her greatest desire. And when Pusey heard of another young lady, the daughter of the Reverend Ellicum, himself also an Oriel affinity, was also interested in becoming an Anglican sister, he sprang into action. Pusey then established a London committee made up of himself and various London Tractarians like William Ewart Gladstone, and began looking for episcopal support, suitable property, and women to staff it, including Sister Jane Ellicum and Sister Mary Bruce. What followed was the establishment of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. While a full history of that society is not particularly relevant here and can be found elsewhere, it is crucial to note that the inmates of this sisterhood did not leave the Church of England for the Church of Rome, unlike Newman's Littlemore. The Sisters of the Holy Cross continued until the end of the 20th century. Given their outward focus in work in education, hospice, convalescence, poverty relief, the Sisters operated as an institution, but their institution existed within a wider affinity of men and women who supported and benefited from their work. Consequently, the Sisters were only ever a small part of the affinity, and the institution which they engendered guided the community, but it was not the sum of the community. When Pusey died in 1882, Liddon immediately determined to write the authoritative biography of his friend. Simultaneously, Liddon established Pusey's memorial, Pusey House, Oxford. This was not to be a college, but rather a library and chaplaincy organized to operate in an increasingly secularizing university. Pusey's example of piety and perseverance in Tractarian principles at the heart of the university rendered him a perfect Tractarian saint and perpetual rallying point against the forces of liberalism and secularism. In 1885, Henry Liddon was offered a bishopric, specifically the Bishop of Salisbury. This must have been a gratifying and tempting proposition. The previous incumbent, George Moberly, had been a staunch supporter of Keble and the Library of Anglo-Catholic Theology. For Liddon to be offered that position so soon after another Anglo-Catholic, Edward King, was made Bishop of Lincoln, seemed to suggest a clear Tractarian transformation of the episcopate. However, Liddon refused. Writing to the Dean of St. Paul's, the Tractarian Dean Church, Liddon set out the reason for his refusal. "I've come to the conclusion that if Mr. Gladstone were to offer me the see, I ought to decline it. My main, although not only reason, is that to accept it would be to give up the plan of writing Dr. Pusey's life." The issue of flexibility is really one of concentration. In life, intimacy relies upon dedicated concentration and focus. For a moment to become intimate, it has to transcend the mundane, not necessarily because of some ontological importance, but because it is observed and recognized as intimate. In this way, everyday actions can still be intimate, such as sharing conversation, observing practices, and living side by side. However, these actions become significant when they are endowed with meaning. Similarly, conversation can be intimate in detail without inherently conveying emotional intimacy. For Liddon to truly experience the continued intimacy with his late friend, intimacy which he craved, he needed to be able to focus on his friend's life. Liddon successfully orchestrated that the Pusey Memorial Committee should establish a Pusey library and house, which would be a home of sacred learning and a rallying point for Christian faith. And thus it will strengthen all that is dearest to a sincere Christian at what, so far as we can judge, must always be one of the chief centers of the mental life of this country. It will form a center of moral and intellectual and spiritual enthusiasm, in which all that is solid in inquiry and learning, and all that is lofty and aspiring in moral effort, shall find encouragement under the consecrating shadow of a great name. If Pusey House was to be the locus of Pusey's genius, then Liddon's life of Pusey was to be the definitive authority by which Pusey's ethos was to be safeguarded and transmitted to the young Anglo-Catholic heirs of the Oxford movement. Consequently, Liddon's 4-volume Life of Pusey was written to express Pusey's sanctity in daily life, rooted in his Catholic faith, and Pusey's defense of the authority of the Church and Scripture. From these themes, Liddon depicted Pusey's participation in the Oxford movement of the 1830s as a natural development of Pusey's own religious convictions and separated him from the Tractarians who owed their religious renewal or revival to Keble. Pusey's involvement in the Oxford movement was, it seemed, evidence of his alignment with the Keble school, not his inspiration from them. Furthermore, Liddon emphasized that Pusey's Anglo-Catholicism of the 1840s onwards arose from a deepening sense of the Catholic claims of the Church of England and his sense of ascetic practice and social obligation. To a certain extent, Liddon's Life of Pusey is the ultimate Tractarian biography. It was literally the last official biography of the remaining original Tractarians to be published. In it, Liddon depicted Pusey as the Oxford movement's ultimate saint, reclaimed the narrative of the Oxford movement, and established an orthodox Tractarian theology which aimed to be conciliar with both the High Church and evangelical parties of the Church of England. To supplement the biography cum hagiography, Pusey House also collected contact relics, like Pusey's death mask and various other bric-a-brac related to those within the Oxford affinity. These relics, and some of them are behind us, both physical and written, seem curated to preserve a representation of proximity through which future generations might come under the personal influence of Dr. Pusey. In this manner, Liddon's portrayal of Pusey is similar to that of Keble's by Coleridge. It sought to repackage both Pusey's history and his theology for the problems of the 1880s. These problems were no longer the apostolical claims of the Church of England or the controversies which had engaged the Tractarians of the 1830s through 60s. Instead, Liddon's Life of Pusey emphasized Pusey working in tandem with a diverse range of ecclesiastical and political figures to defend Christianity against the rising tide of secularism and unbelief. Pusey and Keble placed very distinctive and different emphasis on friendship's role in spiritual formation and renewal. For John Keble, friendship could exercise a transformative ethos, refocusing pairs and groups of friends around moral taste which would underlie their other pursuits. For Pusey, friendship was a positive good and might exert influence on people, but it was never a concept which he found theologically or intellectually stimulating. Instead, Pusey focused on building institutions which would shape individuals who collectively subscribed to a rule. His involvement in the re-establishment of Anglican religious orders, like the Sisterhood of the Holy Cross, is indicative of this. It is somewhat ironic, then, that the two institutions which bear their names and were founded as memorials of them embody genii licorum which correspond not to their named patron, but to their opposite. Pusey, the institutionalist, is honored by a chaplaincy which, although itself an institution, operates through membership which is based on voluntary associations of friends or affinities. Keble, who rarely aimed for any sort of formal or institutional program, is honored by a college, in which members are tied together by formal structures of governance and exist as formal members of the institutional university. The measure of success of these two Anglo-Catholic establishments in fomenting spiritual renewal through an ethos communicated via friendship that connects the modern inmates to their predecessors, locking them together in their communion, is perhaps indicative of the Tractarian experiments in affinity and institution. Thank you.
We now have about 15-20 minutes for questions, and as you think about what question you want to ask, I invite you all to consider the proverb that brevity is the soul of wit. So, please raise your hands if you have a question. May I ask the first question? So, the modern university, the degree factory of the modern university, may not seem to be a place that is particularly conducive to fostering these relationships, these friendships, and these relationships of mentorship between tutor and tutee and professor and student and so forth. And I know that you studied at both Oxford and Cambridge. Do you think that the tutorial system at those universities still offers space for those friendships to exist?
I'm going to answer slightly anecdotally. As an American undergraduate, in an American undergraduate university, I could not really contemplate the idea of referring to my my instructors aside from by their formal title. And that even with a degree of familiarity. I mean, one of my undergraduate instructors, I did my undergraduate in Utah, liked to hunt. And so one of his midterms was we all went to his house and had venison that he'd shot, and then gave speeches imitating various European political leaders, current political leaders, I should add, which was a great midterm. I was assigned Marine Le Pen. But if we're thinking in terms of friendship, I don't know that I mean, I still think of him as Dr. Jacobi. I don't think I could ever really, in my head, reconcile the idea of calling him by his first name or thinking of him as a friend. I felt formative influence, but not a friend. conversely, in the Oxford and Cambridge systems, it's kind of weird if you call your supervisor anything but their first name. And that took a long time to sink in, that you addressed academics by their first name, that you addressed seminar academics by their first name, that you functioned collegiately, that you'd see your tutor at the college bar, that you'd dine with them regularly, that they'd see you stumbling home at all hours of day and night. And so I do think, in a way, the collegiate element certainly demolishes a lot of the hierarchy. That said, of course, there's the ever-present modern concern of safeguarding. I think, while there's nothing ever inappropriate in Keble's letters to Heathcote, for example, and perhaps I'm more conscious of this as a schoolmaster, I think it would feel weird if I was basing my career on the generosity of one of my former students. That would feel perhaps like a moment of infringement that the modern preoccupation with power isn't quite as comfortable with, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, please.
Could you say a little bit more about the nature of friendship?
Sure.
Because it's not my field, I'm not an expert in this at all, but having recently read the Apologia by John Henry Newman, I picked up one or two barbs about Pusey. So I'm thinking about what happened to human qualities or human problems like rivalry and bitterness and anger and competition, etc. And I just wonder, how these were both perhaps avoided or thought about, or the way in which they existed between particularly Pusey and John Henry Newman.
Well, so that's a great question. I think part of the complexity of it is that the relationship was incredibly complex in the aftermath of Newman's conversion to Roman Catholicism. And I'm consciously using, I realize there are plenty of Catholics in the room that might object to Roman Catholicism. I'm using that to distinguish between Anglo-Catholicism, as Catholicism might get confusing as a term here. But if we're looking at the relationship between Pusey and Newman post Newman's conversion, there is a great deal of hurt. The men who stayed in the Church of England and saw Newman leave, their friend leave, were incredibly wounded by this. And I think that wounding is very apparent in the letters they write to each other, in the letters they write to Newman begging him not to convert to Roman Catholicism, in their constant brooding and fear about this possibility in the sort of dying days of 1845. I think there's a real sense of this sort of pain. I think there's also a sense of pain the other way. If you read Newman's novel Loss and Gain, a convert's tale, this is the story from Newman's side in a much more personal way, I think, than perhaps the Apologia allows, written for very different purposes, in which Newman essentially, in Loss and Gain, chronicles the elimination of family ties, friendship networks, university associations that came about because one converted to Roman Catholicism. Newman was stripped of his degrees. His family relationships became even more complicated than they had been before. And he didn't speak with Pusey or Keble in person or even by correspondence for close to 20 years. And I think the severance of that kind of intimacy can only be deeply, deeply wounding. I think that's further complicated by the fact that Newman felt and found many of his frustrations with the Church of England were so happily resolved in the Church of Rome. And so I think, particularly at the time he's writing the Apologia, he and Pusey have re-entered contact. They're talking and writing letters to each other again, and Pusey's attempting the Irenicon, in which he's trying to say that maybe, just maybe, the two churches can look at some sort of ecumenical affinity or association. And I think Newman's quite pointedly saying, no, that's not really a possibility. So that's kind of a more sort of big, grand thing than the nature of friendship itself. But I think that addresses a bit about rivalries. I'll be quick on the nature of friendship in Tractarianism. I don't think from the outset that it's radically different from friendship as defined in that period, more broadly speaking. I think where it becomes significant in a so in that case friendship is familiarity, intimacy, a sense of if you will, collectiveness, really inspired by the classical tradition. Friend today is used much more freely. I sometimes walk into my students and say, "Good morning, friends," and they're not my friends. In case they're watching it, but they're not my friends, right? I exist as their teacher, they exist as my pupils. And as I might occasionally tell them when I'm being a bit more acid, we could one day become friends, but that day is not now. And I think in a way that approximates perhaps a bit more of the 19th century attitude, where friendship was very jealously guarded. This was an important and emotional high point. This was a superior form of love. And also, it was deeply dangerous. I think we're all fairly familiar with the idea that your friends shape you, mold you, and that if you fall in with a bad crowd, you might, every mother's concerned, right? If my child falls in with a bad crowd, what's going to happen to my child? That's so much more heightened in the 19th century reading of friendship. And I think the Tractarians take this on steroids. And that's because they assign to friendship this concept of ethos, in which the spirit of the friend communicates, nourishes, enriches a connection between them that reorientates them soul by soul, or as Newman would put it, heart by heart, towards God. Or not, right? If you've got friends with the wrong ethos, they will pull you in different directions. Not that I'm making the judgment that Newman's friends at Littlemore pulled him in the wrong direction, but certainly to Pusey or to Keble, the ethos of the Littlemore set pulled Newman into Rome, which they would view as at least an intellectual deficiency, if not perhaps also a moral deficiency. Again, highlighting the severity of this severance. So, ethos it's an on steroids way of reading friendship. I think there's possibly a connection to the Phaedrus here. I can't prove that conclusively, but it seems to me that Newman and Froude probably read the Phaedrus together, which is one of Plato's metaphysical works on friendship. I know that Newman was given by Froude a copy of St. Aelred. I think that copy is still at the Brompton Oratory. Not Brompton Oratory, sorry, the Birmingham Oratory. And the significantly, one of the saints that Newman chooses for the Life of the Saints project is Aelred of Rio. So anyway, if that sort of answers those two questions.
We've only got 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, please.
I was going to ask you about the sort of later context of the foundation of these two institutions. You've shown how they draw on two different schools of how you might organise affinity.
Yeah.
But why did they make this different choice in the 1870s and the 1880s? You kind of you maybe implied it, but I'd like you to say, could you say a bit more about that? Why didn't they just found Pusey College in the 1880s? Was it because Keble College hadn't worked? Was it because the world was different? Was it because of a different doctrinal instinct? What?
Yeah, I think there are two things going on simultaneously here, and I think you're right to highlight the sort of gap between 1870 or even 1879 and 1884 is just not that big in the lifespan of Oxford as an institution or a college as an institution. And certainly, of course, Keble College was a tremendous success in its early founding. It was the first college since the Reformation to successfully launch, which was huge. It was not the first one attempted, it was just the first one to make it. It very quickly became one of the biggest colleges in Oxford in terms of numbers of undergraduate, in terms of capacity. It was never fabulously wealthy like, say, John's, but it was still financially very, very secure. And so on the one hand, massive success, absolutely massive success. And on the other hand, there's a recognition as early as the late 1860s, particularly the 1870s, this picks up, that they've lost the institutional university. So there's this great Victorian concern of secularism. The Victorians are very, very worried that that secularization might be happening, and not even might, they can say it's definitely happening. And so in a way that to us seems perhaps laughable, knowing how far through the looking glass we've come, to the Victorian mind, you know, hell was arrived in the form of secularization in like 1880, which if we look at, you know, figures on church attendance, and there's some great work on this. Callum Brown has a fantastic article exploring the concept of secularization in the 1860s, but, or sorry, 1960s even, as far late as that. But to the Victorians, it had happened by 1880. The university was no longer strictly for Anglicans. Non-Anglicans could get degrees. Terrible idea. Parliament was open to non-Anglicans, had been for about 50 years by the point of Pusey House being founded. All the great offices of state were open to just about anybody. And that meant that people had a role in the intellectual life of the Church of England via the Oxford education system, which produced most of the clergy, from 1870 in the actual academic theology faculty that was established. And through Parliament in the appointment process of bishops and the organization of the institutional church. So, you know, this was a big deal. I mean, within living memory, it's been a big enough deal that a fairly recent prime minister delayed converting to Roman Catholicism until he left office, because this was that big of a deal, which seems interesting to us now, perhaps. In an age where we've had a whole host of prime ministers, none of whom we have probably thought too much about their religiosity. Parliament started to reform what colleges were doing in the 1870s, which is one of the reasons Keble College has a very different style of charter. They actually exempt themselves from Oxford. In theory, Keble does not have to be located in Oxford. They could pack up and move. And sort of relinquish any affiliation with Oxford, and their foundation could just leave, which is very medieval. That said, institutionally, it fought so hard to become part of Oxford. By the end of the First World War, it's no longer producing a majority of theology students, which had never been its goal, but that was something that was seen as a sort of bellwether. And certainly by by the 1950s, it was no longer really even a consciously Anglican, high Anglican organization in the same way as it had been set up. So it's a very short lifetime for this institution. And I think in the 1880s they saw that coming. Pusey House, by existing as an affinity model, circumvents all of those issues, right? So, you know, the Oxford University can do what it likes, but Pusey House stands. And in some ways, even the Church of England can do what it likes, and Pusey House stands, right? And it's very Keblean, sort of, if the Church of England falls, we'll still be found in Hursley Parish. And I think in a way that sort of is very consciously done, and it sort of speaks to the shift in what exactly the Anglo-Catholics are concerned about at the time. At the time of Keble College, they're worried about the possibility of losing the institutional university. By the 1880s, they've lost, I think.
We have time for one final question. Very good. Well, I think we're out of time then, and Evensong as usual will be at 5:30, and please join me now in thanking our speaker.